As I say, my name's Robert Tanton. I'm currently the Acting Director at NATSEM, and I'd like to welcome you all to NATSEM's inaugural annual lecture. This is our first celebration this year of our 20th year of NATSEM, and this annual lecture will now be an annual occurrence where we will seek to inform public debate through a well-known speaker. For those who don't know, but I'm sure you all do know, NATSEM is an apolitical research institute committed to informing public debate in Australia on issues of health, poverty, inequality, disadvantage, social exclusion, and other what we call wicked problems. And this is one of the things that I really love about working and about being a director of somewhere like NATSEM. It's the opportunity to contribute to helping to solve some of these, what I call wicked problems. And when I say wicked problems, I'm talking about problems with no simple solution. And so there are a multitude of solutions, and we need to get a multitude of people together from different disciplines to contribute to those solutions. Some of these wicked problems that NATSEM contributes to include things like homelessness, adapting to scarcer water resources in the Murray-Darling Basin, and we're doing a lot of work on that at the moment, jobless families, social exclusion, the cost of living, community wellbeing, an ageing population, chronic disease, Indigenous inequalities, and also spatial inequality. And we're doing a lot of work in each of those areas. Today, we have a number of speakers, and it's with great pleasure that I'll introduce the first of these, who is Professor Anne Harding, who was a director of NATSEM from 1993 to 2009, and someone who I've worked closely with at NATSEM and have learnt a lot from, both with her as a mentor and a friend. And I'm always amazed at Anne's capacity to balance that major research centre, which NATSEM is, and the ability to conduct that important research, which then informs those wicked problems. And so I would like to welcome Anne Harding to the podium to talk about the 20 years of NATSEM. Thanks, Anne.
Well, I first came up with the idea of NATSEM about 25 years ago. And at the time, I was an extremely junior policy officer in the Department of Social Security here in Canberra. And I was working on policy change for ministers at the time. And when a minister came up with what seemed like a good idea, like changing the age pension taper or the rate of the dole or something like that, we used to do what were called back-of-the-envelope costings, which means we'd have a few figures, we'd run them through a calculator, because it was the days before Excel had been invented. And the handwritten notes that we wrote about the impact of that policy change would go down to the typing pool to be written up before going to the minister in 5 coloured copies. And after some years of doing that, I got given a PhD scholarship and was lucky enough to go to study under Professor Tony Atkinson at London School of Economics in the UK. And he was there developing microsimulation for the UK, which of course gave me the idea, and I brought it back to Australia. And the original vision was to have a national microsimulation modelling centre that all Australians would have access to, so that it wouldn't be locked up inside government or be able to be used by only one side of politics or the other. And the original vision, although it seemed far-reaching at the time, was actually fairly simplistic. It was to have a static model and a dynamic model. And a static model merely means you've got a sample survey of what Australians looked like at a single point in time, and you administered some sort of policy shock, and then worked out the difference in their weekly incomes. Whereas a dynamic model was much more ambitious, where you took a large sample of the population and you tried to age them forward for somewhere between 10 to 50 years. Anyway, I went around Australia giving about 20 seminars peddling this vision about static and dynamic models. So just really trying to sell an idea, because we hadn't done any of it yet. So we had a very turbulent first 10 years. I was quite new to management, and NATSEM was a very convivial place, and we had an amazing number of NATSEM affairs and marriages and children. And many of them, those marriages still survive today. But the change of government is also a very precarious environment for an organisation whose job it is to look at the impact of the policy change that's being considered and tell you who's winning and who's losing and by how much. And as Rob mentioned, one of the earlier jobs that we did was to look at the change in the possible tax mix from towards a goods and services tax and more away from direct taxes. And that was so acrimonious. We were grilled by Senate committees at great length. We upset absolutely everybody in this debate. The Liberals were very upset. We found some losers from the package that they put forward. Labor were upset that we hadn't found enough losers. And the Democrats were really insulted that we'd left food in the base and had to look at what that looked like. But by the end of the first 10 years, we had made, I think, some very solid progress. And the first thing I really wanted to mention was that we had, I feel, successfully established a reputation for impartiality. So when we were referred to in the press, we weren't referred to as that left-wing think tank or that right-wing think tank. And gaining that impartiality was very hard. It was a very big ask for an organisation whose results could often be used in such political ways. I'll give you one example. We were doing some work on the impact of a possible tax and social security change during the course of an election campaign for the party then in opposition. And there was a difference between how much better off families were annually versus how much better off they were weekly, because there was one annual payment attached to this scheme. And I still remember vividly lying on the floor in the lounge room at 11 p.m. at night saying, if you go ahead and publish those figures, which are misleading, we will have to say that we disavow them, that we do not agree with them. They are not NATSEM certified. And the debate went for a couple of hours, and finally they printed the version that NATSEM felt was valid. But can you imagine the stress? And although you didn't often have to go to those sorts of limits, it was always important to stress that the numbers would fall out as they did. You know, that we were not going to be in the business of tinkering with the results to suit political ends. There was another occasion, also during an election campaign, when the party we'd done the work for completely unexpectedly on a Sunday afternoon released these figures about tax losses that would be caused by the other party's programs. And I got caught up in the attic of our house on my mobile and literally pinned and unable to move, because as soon as I finished one call, the next call came in and you had to have all the sheets in front of you to argue it. And it got hotter and hotter and hotter. And by the end of it, the phone just conked out. And the company refused to repair it on the grounds it was water damage. So a very hot business. our business. But still, by the end of those first 10 years, StinMod was very well established within government. And this is the StinMod user guide. And I'm still very proud that so many government departments use this. This is the benchmark model off which they will produce a whole raft of results. And that's also an excellent outcome for them because it means they're not fighting about the methodology that underlies the figures. It means they're fighting about the actual policy itself. By the end of the 10 years, we had done a dynamic model, but with somewhat limited success. We had problems with living people marrying dead people and various other issues that came through with the data and so on. So, like countries worldwide, we are still working on dynamic models. But the second decade of NATSEM, I think, was notable for moving beyond that original vision that I'd had. So we moved into all sorts of new areas that hadn't been modelled internationally and were new for Australia as well. So in particular, for example, Rob has been in charge of the regional modelling that we've done here. So now, not only can you tell the poverty rate for sole parents in Australia, in New South Wales, you can do it by suburb. So all your results now can be disaggregated down to a spatial or small area level. We've done a lot more on health, so looking at chronic diseases and also aged care in the future and diabetes prevention strategies, which sorts of measures will give the government the most bang for their buck in the future in the terms of reducing outlays on these chronic disease problems. A brisk business in housing, as we've gone through the significant housing booms and busts of the last few years. We've moved into education and to childcare and also in particular looking at measures of well-being for children and for youth. And finally, also, we've done a lot more on wealth and superannuation. A lot of this, as I was just commenting to Andrew, is fairly dismal, where we're trying to project the incomes of, say, baby boomer women in 30 years' time, when they'll be probably reliant on the age pension, and when none of us are exactly sure what sort of level the age pension will be by then. So, in summary, really we've exceeded my original vision, and I hope very much that over the next decade we make even greater strides than in the last two. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. That was a wonderful history of NATSEM, and one of the main things that I'm taking out of that was the impartiality, and I think that's really important to what NATSEM does. I remember in the last federal election, we were doing costings through the Parliamentary Library. They were for the Liberal Party, for the Labor Party. I don't think we did any for the Greens, but we were certainly doing costings for all of the parties. And that impartiality is really important in all of the work that we do. We've got a couple more speakers, or we've got one more speaker before Andrew Leigh. So I'd now like to invite Professor Francis Shannon, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Canberra, to talk about the contribution NATSEM makes to the university. And Francis will then introduce Andrew Leigh, and if anyone is qualified to talk about helping to solve those wicked problems, then it must be Andrew Leigh. After Andrew's talk, we'll then have some time for questions, and we have a roving microphone for questions, and I will then close up. So thank you, Francis.
Thank you, Rob. I think I'll use this microphone so I don't have to lean forward. I picked out two words out of Anne's talk which I think are really important. One was vision, and the other was impartiality, which Rob has also mentioned. I think Anne's description of establishing NATSEM shows that if somebody has a vision and they're determined enough to implement that vision, then there's always a way to do it. And I think I'm really pleased that it was at the University of Canberra that such a vision was implemented and that it has contributed enormously to the University of Canberra and its reputation over the last 20 years. The other word was impartiality, and I think in academic research, impartiality is absolutely the key and an essential part of what we all do in academic research and how we contribute to the debate out there in the community by showing that the work we do and the results that we generate in whatever discipline or whatever area that we contribute to are done in an impartial and rigorous manner, and therefore contributes in a way that may not be possible from other places than a university. But I'm delighted to be here this evening to join with colleagues and friends to celebrate 20 years of NATSEM. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Andrew Leigh MP, who will lead off these celebrations by giving the inaugural NATSEM annual lecture, as Rob said. You've heard from Rob and Anne about the history of NATSEM and about what NATSEM does at the moment, so I'm just going to try and place NATSEM in the context of the University of Canberra for a moment before I introduce Andrew. The University of Canberra is very proud to have been associated with and hosted NATSEM as one of its major research centres for the last 20 years. Over the 20 years of its existence, it has contributed significantly to the research effort and to the engagement of the university with both government and the community. It makes a significant contribution to research in the areas of public policy, applied economics and beyond, as you heard from Rob and from Anne. The university is also a place of big visions under our current Vice-Chancellor, Professor Stephen Parker, who apologises for not being able to be with us tonight. He's in Japan on a visit funded by the Japanese government to develop interactions between the University of Canberra and universities in Japan. But the university has just released a new vision, a new strategic plan called Breakthrough, and you may have seen the ads around the town and in the newspapers with people jumping through shards of glass and very bright coloured, and you may like it or you may not, but that's our marketing for the next few years. And this plan, as it relates to NATSEM, I guess, states that our research will be of high quality and highly cited. It will focus on discoveries and application that lead to an early improvement in the world around us. So that's our vision for research at the University of Canberra for the next 5 years. NATSEM fits well and truly into this vision, as you would have heard from the previous speakers. It's already contributing and has contributed to this vision over the last 20 years. In its evidence-based policy research and its advice to government and to various community and private sectors. And it's regarded as a world-leading centre for microsimulation, much to do with Anne's development of that technology and bringing it back to Australia and developing NATSEM as a centre for microsimulation. University of Canberra aims to achieve world ranking as a young university by 2018. Now that's a big vision if ever there was one, and it's one that is really great to work within but scary at the same time, because being a world ranked university is not easy. Being a world ranked university means that you have to achieve extremely highly in research, and you have to teach great programs to your students so that they go out there saying wonderful things about the university. We need to build on our achievements of the last 5 years, where we have built strong capacity and capability in research. Just to give you some examples, our research income, our research publications, and the number of our research students have each more than doubled in the past 5 years. So there's been a huge improvement in the capability and capacity of the university to carry out research. We now need, I think, to lift our sights, to engage in the global research enterprise, acknowledging that we work in a global environment in which research done in one country has implications for research in other countries, and I'm sure in the world of economics and microsimulation and modelling, that's definitely the case. The countries around the world are struggling with the same issues, ageing populations, etc., the things you heard about earlier. We need to collaborate nationally and internationally to address these big societal issues. And we need to then be aware of the national or local implications, whether it be at a very local level, at a Canberra level, at an ACT level, at a national level of the research that we do. So carrying out excellent research, performing at an international standard, and making sure that research that we do carry out makes a difference. I think that's what we're all about. And NATSEM will play a key role in driving this agenda. We hope to build NATSEM to an even stronger research entity over the next 10 years. We have invested in NATSEM starting last year for the next 5 years in order to grow its academic reputation, and we will continue to do so. So NATSEM, it's great to see it at a 20-year mark, but we hope to see it at the 30 and 40-year mark being an important part of economic and social policy research in the country. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for the night, Dr. Andrew Leigh. Andrew is the Federal Minister for Fraser since 2010. Andrew is a renowned economist, and prior to joining the political fray, he was a professor of economics at the ANU. Now, that's a different type of fray, but I'm sure it prepared him well for joining the political fray. Dr. Leigh holds a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, and before that, he graduated from the University of Sydney with first-class honours in law and arts. He has worked as a lawyer and as a principal advisor to the Australian Treasury. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, and he has won numerous awards for his work. I would like to ask Andrew now to deliver the inaugural NATSEM annual lecture entitled Estimating Top Wealth Shares in Australia Over the Past Century. Thank you very much for coming here, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Francis, for a very kind introduction. Can I, of course, start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. To also acknowledge, well, since we're talking about inequality, let's start with the people who did the organisation for today's event, Rebecca and Itaz Mehta. I want to recognise Anne Harding. Are you the youngest person in Canberra to have a building named after you, Anne? On not only the work the research work that you've done, but also for building an institution which has, I think, made a profound difference to the political system. As you say, we politicians should be arguing about values and outcomes, not about costings. It's the least productive debate in Australian politics, and NATSEM's contributed to getting politicians focused on the issues we ought to be talking about. Can I also thank Rob and Francis? I want to acknowledge too that the work that I'll present tonight is joint with my co-author Pamela Katic, who is the first person in Ghana that I have collaborated with. But Pamela I first got to know was when she was a PhD student at the ANU, so everything you see will be joint with her. I thought that some of you might be of the Twitter bent, so if you are, then I made up a hashtag for tonight. It's the imaginatively named hashtag NATSEM. Feel free to put up critical or positive comments there, and I'll read them later, or you can have a conversation without me if you'd like. This will also be something more of the flavour of an academic talk than it will be a politician's sort of page-turning speech. I remember Peter Costello once told the story of when he took the GST proposal to Cabinet in the late 1990s, and he decided to do it with a then newfangled piece of technology called PowerPoint. And he said at the end of this sort of complicated presentation, talking about sort of winners and losers and optimal tax theory and income taxation and consumption taxation, he was walking out of the room, and one of his National Party colleagues said, "You know, I had no idea on the tax side, but I really love that PowerPoint thing. We should use that more often." So in the same spirit, I will be reverting to type as an academic wielding PowerPoint. I said for a while after I entered politics that I was a lapsed economist. I've stopped doing that now, and hopefully you'll forgive me if I describe myself as an economist through here. So the first question that we ought to be asking is, why are we interested in wealth, and why are we interested in the top? Let me first answer that by giving you a simple analogy. So let's think about Australian inequality as a ladder. Let's think about each rung on the ladder as representing $1 million of wealth. And let's take a moment just to see how the Australian population lines up against that ladder. So first thing to know is that half of all Australian households are closer to the ground than they are to the first rung. That is, that the median household income is around $500,000, so half the households don't get halfway to rung number one. Then we've got the top 10%. If you want to get into the top 10%, you need $1.5 million in household income, and so everyone up from one and a half rungs up is in the top 10%. You can quietly think of your own household income if that helps, and sob or cheer accordingly. Then we've got the top 1%, a group about which you'll be hearing more as I go through. To get into the top 1%, you need around $5 million of household income, and so, of course, that places them 5 rungs up the ladder. And then at the top of the ladder, we have Gina Rinehart, who is 8 kilometres from the ground. I've actually put, it's not quite to scale because you can see a little picture of Gina Rinehart if you stare carefully at that, whereas, of course, if she were 8 kilometres up, you actually wouldn't be able to see her at all. So that's sort of rhetorically why we might be interested in wealth. From a more economic perspective, you can think of various measures of inequality. You might be interested in thinking about inequality in the in income, which is the flow measure, and that would tell us something about what people have immediately to spend. So, for example, you could look at the distribution of weekly earnings using ABS earnings data. You could look at the distribution of annual income, or you could even average across a couple of years. Others might be interested in looking at the distribution of consumption. So, setting savings aside, what are the spending differences across Australia? And then today I'm going to talk about differences in wealth, which is thinking if we look at the stock of assets held by households, accounting for the debts they have, how different are those stocks across households? Wealth inequality is going to give you the biggest gaps, consumption inequality is the smallest gaps, and income inequality will sit somewhere in between. None of these is a perfect measure for inequality. All of them are telling you something different. The wealth inequality you might be interested in, particularly if you're thinking about intergenerational aspects. If you're thinking about the power to start a business, if you're thinking about the resources you can draw on in a time of crisis. You might also be interested in the top, if you're interested, for example, in understanding differences in power across communities. So, for example, some of the data I'll be showing you is really from the tippy top of the distribution. And that's telling us something about the elite in society and the power that they have to wield in business and potentially in politics. Another reason, for example, is, as Tawney put it around World War I, what thoughtful rich people term the problem of poverty, thoughtful poor people term with equal justice the problem of riches. And so much of what you see in studying inequality is that in times when the top goes up, that tends to be a time when the bottom goes down. Put more technically, the 90-50 and the 50-10 track one another fairly closely, even although mechanically they need not do so. So studying top inequality can teach us something about the whole distribution for periods when it's difficult to know what's going on at the bottom. Australia has a strong tradition of being interested in egalitarianism and interested in maintaining strong equality. Ours is a country which has had central bank governors known as Nobby and Nugget. It's a country where one of our richest people is known as Twiggy, where the word mate is used as a universal leveller. I would comfortably use it to a bus driver or a cabinet minister, sometimes in the same day. We're not a country that typically uses the word sir except out of politeness. And in fact, the only person I know who has earned the title Sir is Sir Tony Atkinson, who is a mentor to both Anne and myself, and whose work you'll see in the coming pages. I'm going to be looking back over a century of inequality, and that's drawing on some very nice data that is available back in World War I. The data, in fact, on Australian inequality are so good for this period that one of the leading papers that Corrado Gini put together, I'm sure many of you have read it, Sulla misura della considerazione della ferrabatia dei Decazarani, used Victorian land distribution data. So those statisticians, people like Coghlan and Nibbs at the time, were putting together very nice statistics, and I'm in some sense going to be standing on their shoulders a century on. So let's talk about data sources, and then we can talk about inequality. We used 3 sources of data in this paper. The first is surveys. So we have a number of surveys of wealth distribution, not as many as we'd like, but we're going to patch those together where we have them. The earliest is the 1915 war census, quite a comprehensive battery of questions. They ask about 20 questions on assets and debts, and it's a census. We have the whole population. Being the Census Bureau or the ABS, they of course shredded the microdata, so we have tabulations to draw on here, and we'll use sort of standard Pareto techniques for extrapolating the tails. Then the next survey we've got is a 1987 Australian Standard of Living survey. We've got the microdata for that, so we'll analyse that. And then the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, HILDA, has a wealth module generously funded by the ABS, by the Reserve Bank of Australia for 2002, 2006, 2010. Roger Wilkins at the Melbourne Institute kindly ran the analysis on the unconfidentialised data for us, and so we'll be using unconfidentialised HILDA at the end. We will be, there's a bunch of ways you can analyse wealth distribution using a survey. We keep only the adults, and then we divide household wealth by the number of adults. So that gives us a measure which, from the surveys, which is a reasonable match for the next source of data I'm going to show you. So the next sort of source of data are inheritance tax data. The inheritance tax is a revenue raiser, but as economists have shown for, again, the best part of a century, you can also think of it as being, there's no polite way of putting this, a sampling technique. Put more precisely, as Tony Atkinson likes to say, if you think of death as a random sampling technique conditional on age and gender, then inheritance tax returns can give you something like a survey of wealth in the population. There we have it. It's a little macabre, but that's the source to which we're going to put the inheritance tax data. That means that we need something like what we have on the left, inheritance tax data, which is broken down by age and gender. We have that from the early 50s onwards. Unfortunately, those tabulations don't exist for the earlier period where we can find them. We got ourselves as dusty as possible, but couldn't find anything earlier than the 50s from which we could do good estate multiplier techniques on. Then there's the standard problem that the poor die earlier than the rich. So you want to do what's called social multiplier adjustment. When I started the project, I thought this would be straightforward. I would take somebody else's social multiplier. It turned out no one had actually done this, at least not with individual data, which is where you get the cleanest results. So I went and wrote a second paper. This tells you something of the age of the project, that the paper here is a 2011 paper with Philip Clark. We used, again, HILDA, and we used the advantage that HILDA is a panel, and from our perspective, though not from the perspective of those in the panel, some of those in the panel died. We can then go back to previous waves, look at what they reported in that period. We discover there that those in the top income quintile outlive the bottom income quintile by 6 years. We use that as our social multiplier adjustment. If you don't do that, then the results you get from the inheritance tax approach aren't as precise. So there's a series of Australian studies, people like Gunton and so on, have used these tax data before, but we're the only ones to adjust for differential rates of mortality. So that'll cut in the 1950s. It will cut out, of course, on the 1st of July 1979, when Australia's federal inheritance tax is abolished. And the third data source is rich lists. Jenny Chesters, who's here, was kind enough to tabulate a range of data from the BRW rich lists. We then went back and got a little bit more from the National Library. I had very patient research assistants enter everyone into spreadsheets, and then we're going to be using the rich list data to tell us about the distribution, the wealth share of the very top relative to total population wealth. So we'll use the Australian Bureau of Statistics and Treasury Private Wealth Series as a denominator. And then we'll also do something else, which I think is kind of one of my favourite bits of the paper. We're going to look at inequality within the rich 200. We're going to ask the question, say you know you're going to be in the top 200, has inequality just within that magazine risen or fallen? So I'll tell you a little bit about inequality within the 200 richest Australians. So there are three data sources. Now, particularly perceptive members of the audience will now be looking at me a little bit like somebody who arrives in Bombay and says, I would only like to eat steak. NATSEM has done some work using a third approach to measure wealth inequality, which is taking income reports of things like dividend income and working backwards to wealth. I'm happy to talk in questions afterwards as to why we chose not to use that approach. But the one useful thing to say is, I guess, that it wouldn't give us a great deal more coverage than we have at the moment. So enough about data, let's look at results. This is our top 1% wealth share for the best part of the last century. It starts astonishingly high. So if we start with that 1915 wealth census, our estimate is that the top 1% of Australians at that stage held 34% of national wealth. That might sound outlandish, but there's another study by, I think it's Martin Shanahan, who uses South Australian probate records. He doesn't do the estate multiplier technique, but it might reassure you to know that when he looks at South Australian probate records from 1905 to 1915, he estimates the top 1% have 30% of national income. So this is pretty close to being in the ballpark for wealth inequality. We have a big gap then to our next data point and a huge drop over that period. So we pick up the series just after World War II with the top 1% having about 10% of national wealth, about 10 times their proportionate share. Then the line sort of wiggles its way down and gets down to what I think of as an astonishingly low point. 1968, we have the top 1% of Australians having only 6% of national wealth. That's just extraordinarily egalitarian, right? They have 6 times their proportionate share, okay, so they're doing better, but they are the top 1%. And then we see a steady rise after that. We see an increase over this period, a little to 1979, and then we jump to the 1987 survey, top 1% with about 10% of national income. Then we go to Hilda, where the top 1% have variously 12, 16 and 11% of national income. So you can think of the final answer. We start with the top 1% having 34%, we finish with them having 12%. Less than half of their share at the beginning of the period. So wealth inequality clearly lower than it was at World War I, but also clearly higher than it was in the late 1960s. So much of this increase, we've seen an increase maybe about 50% increase in wealth inequality over the last few decades, paralleling the results from income inequality, which I'll talk about shortly. Now, we also have this little interesting blip up here, and frankly, we're not quite sure how much to make of it. I'll show you now the top 0.1%, so this is the top 1/1000th of wealth holders, and the top 0.5%. And the important thing to note here is you see the 2006 blip up even in the top 1/1000th of the distribution. So what's going on in the Hilda survey is something that is going on within about 10 to 20 respondents in the Hilda survey. And so we would be cautious about over-interpreting the 2006 blip upwards. Wealth inequality is pretty strongly affected by what's happening at the very top. And while this could be reflective of the rest of Australia, you want to be careful about a result that is driven by literally a few handfuls of Hilda respondents. But again, you see very similar pattern. So let's take those top 0.5%. They have, as you can see, almost all of the top 1% income. The share is about 28% there. It goes down to about 3% here, goes up to about 5 or 6% there. The top 1/1000th, 0.1%, got about 14% of national income at the beginning, 140 times their proportionate share, and by the end they have about 3% of national income, about 30 times their proportionate share. And so, again, a similar pattern from what you see when you look at income. Most of what is going on, what you observe in the top 1% is actually driven by the top 0.1%. Let me now look at another statistic which you can observe in these data. You can look at the gender composition across the century. We find this interesting. So if your main concern is not wealth inequality, it is gender inequality, then this is your good news story. In World War I, the women had only around a third of all top wealth. By the end of the period, women hold about half of all top 1% wealth. You see that sort of wiggling around in the middle of the period, but clearly a move towards egalitarianism on the gender dimension, while we've seen a move towards inegalitarianism on the overall wealth dimension. We can compare wealth and income. This is now comparing a series which Tony Atkinson and I compiled using tax return data. So we wrote a paper in the early 2000s where we combined population data, national accounts and taxation returns to estimate the income share of the top 1%. The two things that I take out of this are, first of all, that income is more equally distributed than wealth. That is, that the top 1% have a smaller share of national income than they have of national wealth. That's not surprising. We know the rich save more than the poor, and so unless it were the case that the rich were spending everything every year, you would naturally expect the top 1% wealth share to be higher than the top 1% income share. But the difference really is very, very stark at the beginning of the period. So we've got a top 1% income share in the early 20s sitting at around, I think it's around 12% in that period, but the wealth share just a few years earlier has been 34%. But then the same sort of great compression occurring principally in Australia in the post-war rather than the interwar period. This is a period in which taxes are fairly high. Australia has top tax rates over 90% during World War II. That affects income because, of course, you're not able to reinvest dividends. You have an impact on work effort. And it also affects wealth because there is less for those at the top of the distribution to save. You've also got a series of regulations in World War II, strong unions, fairly heavy regulation of product markets, fairly closed economy, which all have an egalitarian influence and are driving egalitarianism in both wealth and income. And then over the last couple of decades, you can see wealth and income head up in basically the same direction. Income now goes up a little more steeply than wealth. The top 1% wealth share has approximately gone up by about 50% over this period. The top 1% income share has doubled over this period. So the collapse, wealth inequality drops more than income inequality. The rise, income inequality rises more than wealth inequality. That story for the last 30 years is a pretty similar story to what you see in the United States. So I'll show you in a moment the United States top 1% wealth series, which is, again, a more moderate increase over recent decades than the US has seen for income. People have speculated this is because it takes a little while to build in wealth inequality into a system which starts with relatively little wealth inequality. Dynasties take a while to build over generations. Family assets take a while to build up. And so I think in general we should expect income inequality to lead wealth inequality rather than lag it. Now let's look across countries. So I've here shown the United Kingdom, the solid line up the top, the United States, the dotted line, and then Australia, the dashed line down the bottom. We are not the most equal country in the world. Certainly if I was showing Scandinavian countries, you'd have more equal distributions than Australia. But compared with the US or the UK, there's no period on these graphs in which their top 1% has a bigger share of their wealth than our top 1% has of ours. These are results based on inheritance tax returns, both these countries having inheritance taxes and therefore being able to use them in this sort of macabre random sampling of the population kind of way. Ours, again, a little patchier because we're putting together survey data with the inheritance tax data. Particularly striking, too, is to see how extraordinarily unequal the UK series starts off. So I told you that the top 1% of Australians had 34% of national wealth at the start of the series, and some of you raised an eyebrow. But now if we look up here, we've got the top 1% of Brits in that post-World War I period holding around 60% of their national wealth, 60 times their proportionate share. The bottom 99% of Britons in this period only have 40% of the national wealth to share between them. Britain at the beginning of that period, a much more unequal country in terms of the distribution of wealth and also for top income shares, we find. And then by the end, the United States has moved ahead. Top 1% wealth shares for both the United Kingdom and the United States finishing at around about 20% at the end of that period. Do they track perfectly to the Australian series? No, not perfectly, but you see similar patterns. You see the collapse that runs from World War I right up to as recently as the late 1970s. So in all of these countries, we've got the nadir of wealth inequality being somewhere around the late 70s, the early 80s, and then an increase, but an increase that's not as great as the collapse we saw before. So those are our data based on surveys and inheritance tax records spliced together to look at the overall distribution. But since 1984, we've had another source, which is that BRW magazine has carried out its surveys of the richest Australians. In fact, they start this in 1983, but the 1983 edition is fairly experimental. A lot of the numbers are revised from 83 to 84. 83 only includes 100 people rather than 200 people. So we feel safest to be starting from the 84 survey rather than the 83 one. Is it perfect? Certainly not. There's some oddities about it. So, as you know, Rupert Murdoch renounces his Australian citizenship in the 1980s, but he stays in the rich list until the 1990s. There is revised rich lists which are put out. So Stephen Mayne from Crikey has a go at revising a whole lot of the BRW numbers in I think the late 1990s. And he comes up with some different numbers. You hear stories from talking to people in the BRW rich list about how they go about hiding their wealth from BRW. So it's not perfect, and others, of course, want to be in BRW, so play the opposite game. This isn't a perfect measure by any means, but neither are the surveys and inheritance tax records that I've shown you before. To the extent that these biases are constant, they should affect the levels, but not the trends. So I still think that we can learn something useful out of it. So the first exercise I'm going to do is to show you some wealth shares estimated out of BRW data. Now remember, we only have 200 people here, so we're not going to do the top 0.1%. We're not even going to do the top 0.01%. We're going to do the top 0.001%. Put another way, that is the richest 1/100,000th of Australian adults. Or in the most recent year, because there's about 13 million Australian adults, we're looking at about the top 130 members of the BRW rich list. I'm then going to show you the wealth share of the top 1/1,000,000th of Australian adults. 13 million Australian adults, that's the top 13 people in the most recent BRW rich list. So these are very small groups. I'm just aggregating the wealth of that group, and then I'm comparing it to total private sector wealth from the Treasury series or the ABS series spliced together. So these are those data. Let's take the top line first. That is the top 0.001% share. And you see at the beginning of this period, 1984, we have the top 1/100th of Australian adults holding about 1% of national wealth. By the end, we had them going to nearly 3% of national wealth. So a tripling of the income share of the top 1/100,000th of Australian adults. Going even further up the distribution to those top, what is now the top 13 people, the top 1/1,000,000th of the population, they quintuple their income share from about 0.2% of national wealth to about 1% of national wealth over this period. And now you can see that there's an increase at the end. We've got some mining magnates at the end. But if you were to fit a line through this distribution and cut it off in the early 2000s, you'd get basically the same story. This is not a story about a handful of magnates. This is a story about a steady trend in the BRW rich list. The wealth of those in BRW magazine as a share of estimates of total private sector wealth has approximately tripled over this period. The wealth of those in the first few pages of the BRW rich list has approximately quintupled over this period. So let's now throw away the rest of Australia. Let's now just focus on those who are inside the pages of BRW. And let's look at how person 200 views person 1. How does the last person to make the BRW rich list compare to the first person? We can do this two different ways. Pamela and I can either estimate the Gini coefficient within the magazine, or we can look at a more standard measure, something that Tony Atkinson has done a nice paper on, which is to look at the wealth share of the top quarter of the list. If we've got precisely 200, which they almost never do, that would be the wealth share of the top 50 overall. So I'm going to plot the Gini coefficient on the left axis, and I'm going to plot the share of the top quartile on the right axis. The trends are almost identical, so you're going to see two lines that basically lie over the top of one another. Let's take the Gini first. That's the solid line, left scale. Starting off, we have a Gini within the BRW magazine of about 0.45 at the beginning and about 0.6 at the end. What's cute about this is, you want to know the Gini of wealth across the entire Australian population? It's about 0.6. So inequality within the BRW magazine is actually the same as inequality across the entire population. And it's grown significantly. The wealth Gini gone up from 0.45 to about 0.6. Now, I'm sure, given that this is NATSEM, that most of you naturally think in terms of Gini coefficients, but for those for whom Gini was just a guy who wrote an Italian, let's take the top quartile share. That's the right scale there. Goes up from about 60% to about 70% over this period. So the top few pages of the top quarter of the pages of the BRW magazine have more wealth than the next 3 quarters of the magazine. Wealth inequality is rising overall. Wealth inequality within the rich is going up too. We can also do the exercise we showed you before, which was to look at the share of wealth held by women. Remember that the data before painted a fairly egalitarian picture. So even in World War I, we had about a third of top 1% wealth being held by women, and at the end we had about half top 1% wealth being held by women. For the BRW rich list, some of the listings are families, so we throw away the families. We'll just take men and women in the BRW rich list. We'll add up all of the wealth in any given year, and then we'll calculate the share that is held by women. And the answer is, in those early years, it's essentially nothing. You've got about 1% of BRW wealth being held by women. By the 90s, around about 5%, jumping up and down. And then in the most recent BRW magazine, you have Gina Rinehart come into play. Thanks to Gina Rinehart, the share of BRW wealth held by women is 21% in the 2012 rich list. But if you were to take Gina Rinehart's they don't report it as 28 billion, it's a later estimate which keeps on getting revised. If you take her somewhere between $20 and $30 billion wealth out of the numerator and the denominator, and you ask, excluding Gina Rinehart, what share of BRW rich list wealth is held by women, the answer is 3%. So you've got pretty egalitarian wealth distribution within the top 1%, but not within the top 0.0001%. If you go to the top 1/100th of the distribution, it's very much still a men's world. So what's driving all of these trends I've shown you? Well, you'll all have your favourite theories for inequality, and each of these, I think, have something to say about the top of the distribution. Because wealth of the stock, any factor that affects the flow of income is going to ultimately play into wealth distribution so long as the rich continue to outsave the poor and pass assets on to their children. So standard theories around superstar labour markets are going to be fairly important. Once upon a time, big Australian companies that wanted a CEO looked for the best candidate within Australia. Now they look for the best candidate around the world. When I worked as a lawyer at Minter Ellison in the mid-1990s, the best Minter Ellison lawyers in Sydney were serving the best Sydney clients. By a decade later, they were serving the best Australian clients. Now they're serving the best Asia-Pacific clients. Superstar labour markets are largely driven by technological shifts, and this is an instance of skill-biased technological change, really acting as a force multiplier for those at the top of the distribution. If you are the best sports star, the best CEO, the best lawyer, the best accountant, the best singer, then technology allows you to reach a bigger audience than ever before. So that's why, for example, if you want to look at overall concert revenue that goes to the top 1%, it's a higher share than ever before. If you want to look at the share of movie takings that go to the top 1% of movies, that's gone up as well. Superstar labour markets are everywhere, including, let's be honest, in academia. Then there's tax changes. So big changes in income taxes and inheritance taxes mark this period. Increases, the income tax is essentially established at a federal level to pay for World War I, and it's made a mass tax to pay for World War II. In World War II, the top tax rate is, as I mentioned, 90%. Even as recently as the 1970s, it's sitting at around 70%. Then it's brought down steadily to 60, 50, and now 45%. So big cuts to the top tax rate, and also the abolition of inheritance taxes in 1979 is clearly going to have an impact on wealth inequality, albeit with a lag. Then we've got globalisation. The period of 1915, as Keynes so famously writes, was a period of great international engagement. That marks out Australia as well. Very few barriers to trade or migration in this period, which again was a big advantage to those at the top of the distribution. The rise in tariffs and the restrictions on migration in the interwar period bring down inequality, and the continued protection all-round policies of the 60s and 70s are one factor that lead to less inequality in Australia in that period. So globalisation, again, increases incomes at the very top more than those in the middle. Next, we've got technology. Economists' favourite theory for inequality is, I think, skill-biased technological change. It hasn't caught on among non-economists, largely because we came up with such an awful name for it. But the notion that most technologies advantage those with more skills is, I think, an intuitively sensible one. That was one of my explanations for superstar labour markets before, but it plays out more generally through the distribution. Sometimes with a lag, as you see with computerisation, but generally technological shocks, absent big increases in education, lead to a widening of the income distribution, and therefore play on to a widening of the wealth distribution. And then decreases in union membership also matter as well. So union membership is at half the labour market in the early 1980s, now down to less than a fifth of the labour market. If you want one social institution which acts as a bulwark against inequality, it's a strong union. Unions argue for pay compression within their industry, but then they also advocate policies that lead to pay compression right across the population. So that's a little slice into one aspect of inequality in Australia. It is also, of course, a small teaser for a book I have coming out with black ink in July called Battlers and Billionaires, The Story of Inequality in Australia, coming out from black ink. And since that's a storytelling book, let me finish with one of my favourite stories on inequality, which illustrates, I think, why it matters for Australia, why the issue matters for Australia, and why the rise is important. When he's studying prisoner of war camps in World War II, Gavin Dawes says that he expects to see similar behaviour across men who are being held by the Japanese of different nationalities. He says he expects that when men are placed on starvation diets, 1,000, 2,000 calories a day or less, when they begin to starve down to skeletons, 100 pound of body weight or less, that the national characteristics would be essentially flogged out of them, that everyone would resort to a similar primeval state. But he says he observes exactly the opposite. Within these prisoner of war camps, each of the groups maintain a fundamental national identity. He says the Americans are the cowboys of the camp. They're the ones that run the rice loans program, in which you are able to get an extra serve of rice today if you give up 2 serves of rations in the future. and whose effect can only be that at some point you will have a debt that must be repaid with a week's worth of rations and effectively your life. The British, he says, cling on to their class structure like bulldogs. They maintain the rations that are given to them. If the officers are given better tents and more rations, they sleep in those better tents and they enjoy those larger rations. And the Australians, Gavin says, set up their little male-bonded welfare states. They share everything they have, they ensure that more is given to those who are sick, and they walk out of those prisoner of war camps with a lower mortality rate than the Americans or the Australians. There is something about the Australian national character that marks out equality as important. But there's also something about the trends that I've shown you which concerns me as somebody who values those Australian characteristics. And while our level of wealth inequality is not at the level of the United States or the United Kingdom, you can see an upward trend there, which concerns me and I think merits a more substantial public debate about inequality, perhaps starting now with your questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. My name's Ed Holdaway. I remember reading some studies by the University of Chicago, and they claim one of the drivers for a widening disparity in wealth distribution was recessions. That when an economy goes into a recession, the wealthy people are able to pick off valuable assets at a very cheap rate, and then when the economy recovers, they get a big multiplier effect of their wealth. I was wondering if that came into your studies, and if you agree with it or not.
So, Zed, the best data I guess we have on that is the Great Depression. So if you see an equalising effect of downturns, you should expect to see it first there. As you know, we don't have the depression in our data set for wealth, but we do have it for top income shares. And we don't see a great deal. So where are we? That's 1930, and we've got a small increase, which sort of meets your theory there, but is not massive in the scheme of things. We've got the top 1% share essentially returning at the eve of World War II to the level that it enjoyed pre the Great Depression. So it's a dip, but it's not massive. And then for these later periods, it's difficult to see anything at all. So the early 90s recession is, I guess, the next worst downturn, and that doesn't seem to be marked by a big increase in top income inequality. So, my judgment is that they probably matter, but my guess is they matter in different ways according to the particular character of the downturn. You certainly see over recent years a drop in the top 1% share that accompanies the global financial crisis. And I think that's very much to do with the fact that it is a financial crisis. When you take the stock market down from 5,000 to 4,000, you're immediately going to have an impact on top incomes, because a lot of them are coming from dividends, and top wealth shares. I don't think you then expect to see that out of every crisis, though, because some crises aren't stock market crises.
So, I guess you'd see it more in wealth than income.
Yeah, so I guess what you would be then saying is, Andrew, your 2006 to 2010 numbers are real, not an artefact of that top handful of observations. That's certainly possible. We would love to be tinkering with the Australian Bureau of Statistics microdata on this, but it is very difficult to play with small samples at the top of an ABS survey unless you're willing to become an employee of the Bureau of Statistics, which of course would lose me my current job under the Constitution.
Yeah, Andrew, I think if you go to the chart where you showed the BRW data there, you might be able to answer that question.
So you think we're seeing...
See that dip there? Yeah, that's the GFC. So so the wealth share actually drops during the GFC, but then it bounces straight back up, which is the point you were making, that they then buy things very cheaply during a recession, and that leads to a rebound. And if you have a look at that sort of during the other recessions, the same thing kind of happens.
Well, even the 87 property crash, it's BRW magazine themselves notes that total wealth of the BRW rich list in 88 and 87 is fairly similar, despite the property crash. So it's not a major hit to total wealth.
Okay, so now my question. My question is, I did a bit of reading on this myself, and
writing.
and I sort of got a feeling from a lot of these people who made a lot of money in Australia, because we don't have a lot of inherited wealth until quite recently, that they kind of make money when governments change policy in different things. For example, Lang Hancock suddenly discovered the iron ore in the Pilbara after the government changed the law that said that people could get mining rights. So, and some of the other people also made money after governments changed decisions. So I thought you might want to talk about that.
Yeah, so I mean the classic kind of economic study on this is the Siegfried paper in Review of Income and Wealth, which looks at whether or not the industries in which the rich made their money were competitive at the time that they made their money, and finds that about 3/4 made their money in an industry that was competitive. But I've always found that a bit unsatisfying, because it seems a kind of coarse way of approaching it. The issue you've talked about is a much more subtle one, which was, are there particular decisions that people were able to exploit? And yeah, you are struck when you look at the BRW rich list in Australia, and BRW has even commented on this themselves, that there seems to be an increasing preponderance of inherited wealth, relatively few entrepreneurs, certainly a dearth of scientists, certainly no Nobel Prize winners. There don't seem to be as many entrepreneurs on that rich list as one would like. Jenna Reinhardt, for example, enters the rich list at the year after Lang Hancock dies. He goes out with 150 million. She and Jenna Reinhardt and Rose Porteous come in with $75 million apiece. She does turn 75 million into 20 billion, but she also starts with a level of wealth that would place her 75 rungs up on that ladder that we began with. Indeed. So the price, well, that's not mechanically true. The price of iron ore has gone up tenfold, so that should only take your wealth up tenfold. There's also been a series of clever business decisions that Jenna Reinhardt has made. But better understanding the competitiveness of the industries in which the rich make their money is, I think, really worthwhile. You were good enough to share your data with us, and I'd be happy to share these data with others who wanted to analyse it.
John Goss, Serif, University of Canberra. How much might the wealth of the rich be a factor in explaining increased inequality? Because it's in the interests of the rich to spend a lot of money so as to increase inequality. So they might, for example, endow chairs for right-wing economists who will combat those evil Keynesian ideas, and they might perhaps buy up mass media, which will put out propaganda which will favour an increase in inequality. So how much does their very wealth lead to an increase in a climate which favours inequality?
John, I think it's a part of what's going on. So, for example, the Institute for Public Affairs has always argued for small government, except for recently when it's gained a new interest in government spending money on expanding Northern Australia. That may have something to do with recent donations that they've been receiving. Then you have Clive Palmer's $1 million+ donation to the Liberal National Party, but then you also have Graham Wood's $1 million+ donation to the Greens, who typically advocate more progressive tax scales than we currently have. So, yeah, I think it's an issue. It's not as much of an issue as it is in the US, where the Koch brothers have been playing a really corrosive role in US politics. But it's one reason why you worry that too much inequality could corrode the polity, and it probably is wealth inequality that's the yardstick there rather than income inequality, if you're thinking about how much you can donate.
Thank you. My name is Yogi Vidyatama from NATSEM. I have 3 questions actually. The first one, from the first database on the inheritance tax and wealth from Hilda, how many percent in these top 200 can be captured in that one? And if there is not many, is there any possibility to join these 2 databases together? Okay, the second one is on the BRW. The issue of family inheritance and the dispute among family, can it be dealt with in counting how many person have the wealth? First, given that to probably avoid tax, parents can put the name of the children into the wealth, and secondly, of course, the dispute in the case of Gina Reinhardt, for example, should be considered in calculating her wealth. The third one is the more provocative one, is your theory about the union and the equality. If the union is too big, then it's probably not too good for the equality as well, considering it can be like a Communist Party where the power is so big and the leader of the party has too many power in that case. So that's the third one. Thank you.
Excellent. On whether we can join inheritance tax records to the BRW, they don't overlap. Inheritance taxes were abolished in 1979. The BRW series starts in 1984. In principle, we could do it, although you would be thinking about essentially the wealth of the top 10 people each year. Say that someone on average joins the BRW rich list for the last 2 decades of their life. You'd be thinking then of the top 10 people in the inheritance tax data. And I don't think they're fine-grained enough to be able to precisely get at that. In terms of gifts to children, I mean, I take this as a sort of statement about the difficulty of measuring wealth in the BRW series, which is, again, going to be an approximation, as almost all of our data are, including the data that go into STENMOD, for example. Unions and growth, I've never seen a study that suggests that, I mean, it's straightforward to do, right, within countries, across countries, but I've never seen any empirical evidence that the unionisation rate is a drag on growth.
You can always argue that Communist Party or Golkar in Indonesia was a labor movement before it became too big.
Sure, but that's a story rather than a general rule that falls out of the empirical data.
A couple of questions over here. Ben and here, and the third one after that. Run through.
Sheldon Gong from NATSEM. Andrew, so each society has its own social norm, which determines its own social welfare function. I'm curious, what's your opinion? So what's your ideal Gini coefficient for Australia, if you like, between 0 and 1? 0 being
Right.
completely equal and 1 is extremely unequal. Thank you.
So my thesis advisor, Sandy Jenks, who wrote a famous book on inequality in the early 70s, told me a few years ago he had signed up to write a book called What is the Right Level of Inequality, and had to pull out because he realised he couldn't answer the question. My sense is not too much greater than we have at the moment would be my sort of warning bell. Certainly that's borne out in surveys, for example. So the ACTU collaborated with some economists a couple of years ago and surveyed people on what they thought was the wealth distribution in Australia. and what they thought it should be. And you found that even if you only looked at the most affluent respondents, they wanted a far more egalitarian wealth distribution than currently exists. So I don't think I'm out on a limb to be saying let's not allow it to get too much more unequal.
Ben Phillips from NATSEM. Firstly, thanks for your presentation, Andrew. My question relates to what concerns you more in terms of inequality. Is it the inequality that's induced by the super wealthy, say the top 0.00001% you were talking about, or is it the inequality that we might see in some of the more mainstream, say surveys that say NATSEM might deal with, which might say compare the 90th percentile with the 10th percentile, or the more broad measure, say the Gini coefficient?
So clearly the work that NATSEM does is more important than the work that I do here. But Ben, no, I actually think that's right. I think that poverty is more important than top incomes. But one of the challenges that we face as a society is that the 90-50 does matter. So to take your 90-10 and break it in half, we can break the 90-10 into a 50-10 measure, which I would think of as relative poverty, and a 90-50, which I would think of as some measure of top incomes. I think I place more social weight on the 50-10, but I think the 90-50 matters for things like influence over politics and just the general sense that we're all in it together. To the extent that a group of Australians are increasingly privatising their lives, relying entirely on private transport, private schools, private security, in some cases with gated estates, relying on private roads, then I think they lose a little bit more of the sense of common interest that makes us a strong society. So I worry about the 90-50, albeit that the 50-10 matters more.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm looking forward to your book. Wondering how much do we know about the mobility of wealth in Australia? So is it the same people and the same families that are in the top 1% over a period of time?
So not very much is the answer, but we could learn a great deal more. One of the fascinating strains of research that's coming out of mobility over the last couple of years is this series of papers that looks at uncommon surnames. So what's your surname, sir? Hawkins.
Hawkins.
Yeah, so Hawkins wouldn't quite do it. Leigh might do it. Something like Ngunnawal would certainly do it. And you try and look for the preponderance of those surnames either in an elite group at the top or the bottom of the distribution in one period of time, and then you look back again in decades to come. No one's done this for Australia, but it would be straightforward to do, whether it's from rich lists or who's who, using convict records and seeing how those uncommon convict names spread through the population. This is, I think, an interesting way of learning more about mobility. In terms of our overall level of social mobility, I've done a paper using as many father-son surveys as I could find, which suggested that our level of intergenerational mobility places us middle of the pack. Intergenerational elasticity about 0.25, worse than Scandinavia, better than America, and that doesn't seem to have changed much since the 60s. We exhausted the questions. This is great, right?
Are there any others? One more.
Good.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm Tristan Metcalf from the Department of Finance. I'm just wondering...
Now, Metcalf would work for one of those studies, yes.
It'd be nice to get to the top of the distribution. It's often claimed that social ills and antisocial behaviour in general is correlated with inequality. Did you test any crime statistics or anything like that to see if that does actually hold?
So, Tristan, this is the spirit level argument, essentially, which is that if you reduce inequality, then life expectancy will rise, infant mortality will fall, crime rates will fall, and trust will increase. I would love to believe that all of this is true, but the empirical research I've done just doesn't back it up. These things are true in the cross-section. So if we took a scatter plot and we put the US in one corner and Scandinavia in another corner, you'd find that America is crime-ridden and unequal, and Sweden has little crime and is equal. But if we did something a little bit more complicated and we said, let's look at some countries where inequality has risen, some countries where inequality has fallen, and let's look at what's happened to health and crime in those places, the thing just falls apart at that point. There's nothing there in most of these relationships. I've certainly looked at health, I've looked at crime, I've looked at savings, I've looked at growth, where we actually find that a bit of inequality is good for growth. So I think the reasons to care about equality are much more fundamental and come back to the things that you're taught in the first couple of days of an economics class. Marginal utility of income declines. $1 brings more happiness to a pauper than it does to a billionaire. I think that's why we should care about inequality, rather than because it is a magic bullet to solve all social ills.
One thing I would like to say, Andrew, is I love the historical perspective that you've got there. I love sort of looking back at statistics right back to 1915 and just seeing that historical perspective. I think it's really important. There are a couple of other events that will be coming up with NATSEM to celebrate our 20th anniversary. There will be at Parliament House later on in the year an expert panel discussion, and we'll be sending emails out about that later on in the year. There's the International Microsimulation Association Conference coming up in December of this year, and there's an announcement about that on our website. So all you micro-simulators out there, start sending your abstracts in. There's a couple of thanks that I'd like to make tonight. A couple of people who've been organising this. Rebecca Castles, who is organising a lot of our events this year for the 20th anniversary, and it is Mida Mahanti for organising this event, and also for setting up Sarah Thompson, who's our front desk person, helped to set up tonight. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the speakers, for Anne Harding, Francis Shannon and Andrew Leigh. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.